gloss all in these introductory remarks. It's a packed 12-page report. We have printed copies in the front. Please grab a copy, read it if you haven't. I can promise you it's well worth the read. We will circulate it again to our AAUP listserv. If you're not subscribed to the listserv, take a note card and give us an email, and we will gladly subscribe you. But I do want to share with you a few key takeaways from that report. So this is sort of what we learned, some of the things we learned in writing. As faculty, we research, teach, mentor, consult, and serve in many varied ways at UW. And across the campuses, schools, and ranks, all of us are operating under austerity conditions. That's true for the over 1,000 part-time lecturers employed at UW, 78% of whom earned less than $20,000 annual compensation during the most recent academic year. At the other end of the spectrum, that's true for School of Medicine faculty, where in many nationally top-ranked departments, the current rate of compensation falls below the national average in that specialty. So differently true, to be sure, but true across the board for all of us. At every rank, we lag grossly behind our peers in absolute numbers, and all the more dramatically when salaries are adjusted for the regional cost of living. University of California campuses are the only institutions with a comparably high cost of living, and their average salaries are 20 to 40% higher than ours. From 2019 to 2022, the typical compounded raise of most faculty at UW was 5.3%, even as inflation surged to 15.8%. So in these grueling pandemic years where we struggled to meet the university's core educational responsibilities under seriously adverse conditions, most of us experienced a substantial effective pay cut. When we raise these concerns about compensation, staffing levels, workload, we are told that there is just no money to be had. We're told it's a zero-sum game. If X receives appropriate levels of funding, then funding must be subtracted from Y. Only administrators grasp the big picture, are told they are the ones making the hard decisions on our behalf. But the data makes very clear that the austerity that rules our lives as faculty simply does not rule in other departments of the university. In the period since 2018-19, the number of UW administrators has grown by 26%, from 157 to 198 high-ranking positions. So associate vice provost, assistant vice president, assistant dean, associate dean, like that stratum of administration. I should say it's grown by at least 26% because for reasons we get into in the report, that's actually a substantial improvement. As faculty numbers remain flat, the ranks of administration balloon. Looking at these numbers, it's really hard to avoid the conclusion that the university recruits ever larger numbers of highly remunerated administrators to explain to the rest of us why there is no money. While faculty received a typical compounded raise of around 5.3% from 2019 to 2022, as mentioned, the real salary for UW coaching staff went up by 35%. Administrative raises varied, an average of 8.6% increase for associate vice presidents, 15% for president also. So this and other data included in our report makes crystal clear that faculty at UW are a low priority. It's really instructive, I think, to compare the funds dedicated to the Provost's Faculty Recruitment Initiative, which is earmarked to build and retain a diverse and inclusive faculty. This is basically the pot of money committed to the recruitment and retention of underrepresented faculty. Grand total, $500,000 for all three campuses. All schools, all three campuses, $500,000, which is less than half the salary of a single assistant professor. So as we say in the report, the budget is a statement of values, and the values expressed in the UW budget do not align either with its stated commitments, for example, to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, or its core mission of instruction and research. The current situation in which faculty members remain flat amid rising numbers of students, in which salaries not only stagnate but fall decline year by year relative to inflation and regional cost of living, in which faculty concerns are routinely ignored by the ever greater number of university administrators, is just quite simply untenable. So, in a word, the state of the UW faculty is not good. But we didn't bring you here today to depress you. So, fortunately, happily, our speakers this afternoon will share with us some of the ways in which faculty at other institutions have organized to address these issues, to build faculty power, and advance fairness and equity in their institutions. So I'm really delighted to welcome them this morning. So I'm just going to introduce everyone very briefly, and then we will move into comments. So our first speaker on the far right is Bill Line, who is professor of English at Western Washington University and president of the United Faculty of Washington State. That is the union representing faculty at Central Washington, Eastern Washington, Western Washington Universities, and the Evergreen State College. Very good? Very good. Thank you. So come on up there. Welcome, David. I don't know if you can see I started for this afternoon. Today's guest will be Linda Wells, who is an associate professor of cultural education and counseling psychology at Western Michigan University, and also a member of the AAUP National Board. And our third speaker to my right is Mia McIver, who's a lecturer in the writing program at UCLA. He is president of UCAFT, that's the University Council of the American Federation of Teachers, and past president of UCAFT Local 1747. So our speakers are going to speak just a quick note on format before we get started. Our speakers are going to speak briefly this afternoon because we want to be sure to have a good chunk of time on the other side for the Q&A, for discussion. And there, as you can see, we have a reception afterwards, so at some point we will move from the more formal Q&A to the more relaxed chatting over drinks. You are welcome to, of course, pose a question by raising your hand. Or also make that circulating if you would prefer to ask a question anonymously. You should all have note cards or raise a hand. There'll be folks kind of moving up and down the aisles. Write your question down, pass it to the side, and we'll have people flashing those. So think of it as a very low-tech person. All right, thank you so much. Bill, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Here, I want to, I guess we've blown sort of the dramatic impact of this already. My name is Bill Line. I'm an English professor up at Western, and I'm the president of the United Faculty of Western State, which as Eva said, we represent the faculty at Eastern, Western, Central, and Evergreen. My job is mostly driving around and drinking with politicians, so that's what I spend most of my time doing. Just briefly, I mean, the law that allows four-year faculty in this state to organize passed in 2002. By 2006, the four regional institutions were all unionized. I would claim that that's been a great success, not only for the faculty, but also for the institutions generally. Not only have our material conditions improved really dramatically in the time since we've been organized, but also our relationships with the administration. And it's made it clear to me that, I used to walk around thinking all administrators were assholes. And actually, I know quite a few of them now, and many of them are okay. And what we have are different interests. That the 50 years of disinvestment in public higher education has made an administrator's job a very different thing than it used to be. And you're running corporations, you're worried about institutional debt, you're worried about all kinds of things that don't have really much to do with the, with the academic mission of the institution. And any one of us, probably were we shoved into one of those jobs, would eventually begin behaving in the same ways. What collective bargaining does is allow us to come to the table and nobody gets to leave until we've actually agreed to something. So there are some real imperatives to trying to understand and appreciate the other side's point of view. And there have even been one or two times when I've said to an administrator, "Oh, I never thought about it that way. You got a point." That doesn't happen that often, but it is part of the dynamic. And collective bargaining just creates a much healthier relationship between the administration and the faculty because we are at the bargaining table legal equals. And if we screw it up there, we've done it to ourselves rather than having it done to us, which was what was going on before we were organized. So, in an effort to get to your questions, I think, and get to probably the more exciting stuff from other states. No, I think this you can't see it. I want to run briefly through some of the things that have happened from collective bargaining. The obvious one is salaries that I think everybody would be most interested in. One of the myths that, in all good faith, a lot of administrators walk around believing is that there is no money for salaries beyond what the legislature appropriates. That's demonstrably not true by our experience at all four campuses over the last 15 years. We have very rarely had a year in which we bargained a salary that was either equal to, we've never bargained for less than what the state appropriated, and only once or twice bargained for what the state appropriated. The law allows the universities to use all of the funds they have from whatever sources they come to pay faculty. And at the bargaining table, I mean, if you'd have told me 10 years ago that I would know as much about accounting and financial statements as I do now, I would have shot myself in and just called it a day. But there are lots of interesting things about university budgets that show lots of resources available in lots of places that when you're at the bargaining table, you can make stronger cases need to be used for the primary academic mission of the institution. So these are the raises we've gotten at Western. On the left side is the year. In the middle is what the legislature appropriated for salaries in that year. And on the right is what we bargained. As you can see, there were really only 2 years, and they were the pandemic years. There was no money appropriated for salaries in 2020, so we didn't get any raises that year. The next year there was 3%, and we bargained, since we were still coming out of the pandemic and everybody considered it a big emergency situation. Although, if you're really interested, we could get into some of the pandemic stuff that happened. I mean, the universities didn't lose very much money at all during the pandemic, thanks to the federal funds that came in. But every other year besides those 2 years, we're at least a point or a point plus ahead of what the legislature appropriated. And these are just the last 5 years, 5 to 6 years. In the 2024 one hasn't happened yet, obviously, but that's what it's in the contract now that we're getting 5% next year after the 5% this year. When we first started working on this at Western, our salaries were in the 29th percentile of our peers. We were desperately underpaid. Western was starting to become a much more expensive place to live. It was incredibly difficult for us to recruit faculty. Now we're in the 75th percentile of our peers. So the raises that we got in the years between 2007 and 2018 were much greater than what we were usually 2 or 3% ahead of what the legislature appropriated because we were trying to catch up. So this is the story on salaries. It again is is, I mean, it's probably the same thing I would say if I were an administrator. It's a handy myth that that the idea that the university, I mean, I've even had administrators tell me the university is legally not allowed to pay us more than what the legislature appropriates, which is just utter nonsense. But that notion that the only money available for salaries is the money that the legislature earmarks for salaries in the budget appropriations to the institutions is not true. And certainly, I mean, at the bargaining table, I've had budget officers from all four institutions come and say, well, if we gave you guys a 3% raise, the university would be broke in 2 years. And they sort of start with, university falling into the ocean and things like that. And we'll end up settling for 4%. And sure enough, 2 years later, the university is still stuck. So there's certainly, I think, resources to be had. I think it is a virtue of the collective bargaining process that it allows us to remind our administrative friends that faculty are, in fact, the mission of the university and the primary mission of the university, and we need to do more than just give lip service to that. Some of the other things that we've been able to do in collective bargaining, and these are just highlights, and I'll go through them pretty quickly. We have workload protection. In our workload section, the university cannot either raise our teaching load or raise class sizes. If they wanted to do either one of those things, and they haven't since we've organized, but if they ever did as a way to balance the budget or something like that, they would have to come back to the table and bargain it with us. That's never been a thing that they've wanted to come back to the table to do. But left to their own devices, a handy way often for deans to balance their budgets is to either increase class sizes or assign more classes to faculty. Contractually, they're prohibited from doing that in our contract, and that's. I mean, there's different versions of it at the four schools, but that kind of protection is there at all four of our contracts. Western is actually the only institution in the state that still has 100% pay for professional leave. So when we apply for sabbaticals, it's in the contract that, I mean, it's statutorily limited the number of quarters that a university can give out in sabbaticals. It's in our contract that the university must give out the maximum of those quarters every year, and all of those sabbaticals are funded at 100% pay, not the 75 or 50% thing that you see at a lot of other institutions. And that's been something that we've held on to pretty tenaciously through successive bargains over the years. Parental leave, I look constantly on the UW listserv here and the AAUP listserv, and have seen the discussion about parental leave. That's a thing we bargained a couple of contracts ago for exactly a lot of the things that people were talking about on the listserv. Both parents get a full quarter off with full pay when you are the birth parents of a child, when you adopt a child, when you foster a child, basically any kind of parental arrangements that faculty make, you get a quarter off with pay. And that's evolved from what we used to call maternity leave, which was in our original contract many, many years ago, which was treated like sick leave, and you only got 6 weeks off, which made it weird to come back in the middle of a quarter. And so we've that's been a pressing issue for a lot of our faculty, and we've been able to secure those kinds of accommodations for anybody with any version of kids that's important. The NTT stuff, I'm especially proud of. I mean, we've been bargaining this for years. We now have lecturers, senior lecturers, and I don't know what we're calling the third one, but yet another promotion step for non-tenure track faculty. Non-tenure track faculty who work half-time at the university with appropriate reviews for 5 years are promoted to senior instructor, which then comes with 3-year contracts. That if you're a senior instructor, you're guaranteed, in working in the last year of your contract, you're guaranteed another 3-year contract at least half time for assuming you're passing all your reviews and things like that. Given that we have so many long-term, really career non-tenure track faculty, we've made it the ladder look a lot like it does for the tenure track faculty. You get promoted to senior instructor, you can get promoted again. The NTT faculty have participated in every raise we've received. So all of those numbers you saw for our across the board raises in various years, every faculty member who was 1/6 or above at the university gets those kinds of raises. There's no distinctions between tenure track and non-tenure track when it comes to the across the board raises. The promotion ladder, I've looked at a lot of NTT contracts around the country, and I think we have one of the best arrangements for our non-tenure track faculty in the country. But we've really made that a priority and have really been successful in doing that. Thank you. The other great thing about organizing is that you get union muscle in Olympia, and in a state that is fully run by Democrats, union muscle matters, and we've been very successful. And this is a place where we've actually worked very closely with not only our administrations at the institutions we represent, but with your administrations too. We've regularly done work. I've partnered with Anna Mari Kase on a couple of things. I know Joe Dacca really well. He's a very nice guy. And we have a lot of shared, when we get off campus and stop fighting about how we're going to divide up the money and get into Olympia, and we both have pretty much the same interests. We all want more money for higher education. So we've been able to work really well together over the last 10, 15 years. And I think that has been a bonus, not just for faculty, but for all of our institutions and all of higher ed generally. But when we are able to come in solidarity to Olympia and sing off the same song sheet, it's much more powerful than it is with just. The first time I ever went to Olympia, the president of my university was there the same day, and I spent the day walking past her into one legislative office after another, and then finally into the governor's office. And about halfway through, I caught on. It was WEA and AFT that had knocked on the door for me, and they have 100,000 voters and the biggest tax in the state. And college president isn't bringing any money or any votes when they go to Olympia. And at the end of the day, what politicians do is count money and votes. Our organizing has been a boost for higher education, just in terms of our political stature in Olympia, in a dramatic way. And some of the things that we've been able to do, we've made real progress on very quickly. We've made real progress on the fund split, which is the split when they do appropriate money for salaries. It's split between state appropriations and tuition. For a long time, especially during the recession, they created a formula that made the majority of that tuition. Piece by piece, we've been making real comebacks on that. Evergreen is now funded at 85% state appropriations, with other 3 regionals are funded at 70%. WSU is close to that at 68 or something, and UW is at 60%, which is a dramatic increase from the 35% that it was during the height of the recession. We've been big participants in the College Promise Coalition. I even have, I spend a lot of time hanging out with the guys from the Business Roundtable of all people. But we have a common interest in advancing higher ed, and we have a coalition that includes all of the institutions, all of the nonprofit people who are interested, business, labor, and that has made us much more powerful in Olympia. And the big success we were able as a coalition to create was 3 years ago. with the Workforce Education Investment Act, which was a new tax on business that generated like $1 billion for higher education, the majority of which goes to the Washington College Grant, which is now the best need-based financial aid system in the country. It's first dollar in, and it's an entitlement. Everybody gets it. If you make $60,000 or less in the state, you go to school for free, in the state pays. And so those are some of the things we've been able to do in Olympia. Overall, like I say, I think it's been good for all of us. It's been good for certainly our material conditions. The faculty have improved dramatically, and we have a much better relationship with our administrations than we did before we organized. And we've been able to establish a much greater political base for our role in the state. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues, my much more experienced colleagues from other states, who will tell you all kinds of other good things about unions, I'm sure. Yeah.
Turn the mic down a little bit with the height difference. Can everyone hear me? Let's see. You can hear? Let's see. Is that better? Excellent. Thank you very much. I first want to thank Ava and the entire AAUP UW chapter, as well as the chapter leadership, for inviting me. And I also want to thank all of you for being here, taking time out of your busy schedule to attend this very important faculty forum, where we'll be discussing a lot of issues relevant to faculty. Excellent. And as Ava mentioned, I am an associate professor of cancer education at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. And I also serve as the AAUP National Council. And in that role, I also am chair of the Racial Justice Committee. And so today I'm going to be presenting on two specific things. The first being talking a little bit more about the racial equity initiative that we have going on at AAUP National. And then second, I'll talk a little bit more about equity issues as it relates to salaries. And I'll make some connections to some of the information that Ava talked about that's contained within the State of Faculty report. At AAUP, we actually began the Racial Equity Initiative in 2020, after this country witnessed the murder of George Floyd of Minnesota. And AAUP National, like all other organizations, really had to grapple with this incident and what was at the heart of this incident, which was systemic racism. And so at that time, Council created what was called the Racial Justice Committee, and I was named to chair that committee. And from that committee, we had the Racial Equity Team. And the Racial Equity Team really serves as a working group to help foster and facilitate racial equity initiatives within AAUP. So after forming the Racial Equity Team and the Racial Equity Committee, we then searched for a diversity trainer that could help staff and council members become more aware of racial diversity, as well as begin to start looking at our work from a racial equity lens. And so we spent several months going through training with diversity training. And then after the diversity training, we developed 3 working groups that would examine how we do our work at AAUP National from both a racial justice and equity standpoint. Some of the outcomes of this work included and will include a revision of the Red Book, and that will be coming out soon. And also, for the very first time, AAUP went beyond just censoring institutions for its misconduct.
If you all remember, the University of North Carolina was condemned in a special committee report that was published in 22, and it looked at all of the issues that were going on at the University of North Carolina, including issues of systemic racism. We have been in the racial equity initiative for 3 years now, and I still feel like we're at the beginning. However, becoming a more racially just organization takes time. It takes a lot of work, and of course, it takes a lot of effort. Dr. Ivy Mulvey, who is our AAUP president, and I, we talked more extensively about the racial equity initiative in one of the podcasts AAUP presents. And if you all have not had the opportunity to check out or listen to some of the AAUP podcasts, I highly encourage that you check it out. We will also extend and provide an extensive overview of some of the racial equity initiative work that we've been doing over the last 3 years. We'll provide that overview at our biennial, which is scheduled for 2024, and I hope to see some of you there. I will, in this portion of the presentation that I'm going to be talking about with regard to racial equity work at AAUP, by sharing a little bit of a story. In my role as the chair of the Racial Equity Committee, I often like to ask chapters, what are you doing to promote racial equity in your chapters? And I was able to get an answer to that question with one chapter who talked about, and this particular chapter is a collective bargaining chapter, they talked about one of the things that they did was started to work within their contract, and they worked with the administration to then start getting copies of the tenure and promotion letters sent directly to the chapter. And they mentioned and said to me that over time, they started noticing a strong racial disparity between their non-white faculty members in terms of tenure and promotion. After they compiled all of the data, they were able to present the findings to the administration and then began to ask the administration the question about this racial disparity within the faculty. Next, I would like to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. But we've heard a lot about these words in the last 2 years. And as many of you know, there has been an assault on academic freedom using DEI. And AAUP National has closely monitored these educational gag orders and have been offering tips and strategies to faculty members and institutions with regard to addressing these matters. Several resources are available on the AAUP National website, so I highly encourage you to check out the website. We want some additional resources in that area. And while we know a lot about DEI because of all of the negative attention that it has gained, but we also realize that little attention has been given to pay inequity and salary disparity in higher education. And this topic just does not gain and garner the same amount of attention, and I think it should. Of course, AAUP analyzes faculty salaries periodically and have noted historically that there have been major gaps in salary and compensation on gender lines as well as racial lines. And in all of these studies, we've seen these disparities despite the length of service at an institution, despite your academic discipline, and despite your rank. And oftentimes we know that those are the 3 areas that usually account for most of the variations in compensation. But even with all those things, we notice that there are statistically significant variance in factors with regard to gender and pay and racial inequity. I also noticed that in the state of the faculty report, as Ava highlighted, you are also experiencing some of the racial and gender disparities in compensation, especially when you start comparing and looking at other campuses, when you're looking at faculty ranks, and when you're also looking at other institutions. And if you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at the report, I think you should. I also want to commend the faculty and commend the chapter for putting together such a comprehensive and detailed report. You all should be very thankful and grateful for the chapter leadership in putting all this information together. It takes a lot to put. The report also highlighted differences in compensation for part-time and contingency faculty. And I think Mia is going to do a wonderful job talking a little bit more about that in my presentation. The state of faculty report also mentioned compensation concerns among the medical faculty, as Ava mentioned. But this also has been a national conversation among the Association of American Medical Colleges. In fact, they conducted salary and compensation surveys in 2019, 2021, and last year. So you are right on target with also getting involved in a national conversation about compensation, especially as it relates to medical school. I also want to share that, like many other institutions, you all started to examine and take a look at your inequality in compensation and salary. There are other institutions that are also doing that as well. The example that I want to provide is the University of Oregon. They are an AAUP member, and they are a collective bargaining chapter. They too took on the task of examining their data and their salaries. And in 2018, they conducted the study, and it was concluded in 2019. And of course, they also found racial and gender disparities in their compensation survey. And they were also able to identify the faculty that made significantly less. And what they decided to do about it as a collective bargaining chapter is that they did sign a memorandum of understanding with the administration to then compensate those faculty that had lower salaries. And they provided actually a remedy for all of these salary injustices. Other institutions that I was easily able to find on a website and on the internet who had also conducted salary studies included the University of Alaska, Duke University, University of Wisconsin, just to name a few. I will conclude this portion of this kind of presentation by saying three things. And I'm going to quote Bill here a little bit. But the idea is that when faculty come together, they can ask administration difficult and tough questions. And the example that I have for that is that chapter that started collecting data about the salaries, about the tenure and promotion, and was able to start talking to the administration about the racial bias that was embedded in the tenure and promotion process. The second thing about what Bill said is that when faculty come together, they're able to create real change. An example of that was the University of Oregon. They came together, found out about the salary disparities, developed an MOU, and was able to then create a remedy for the salary injustices. Real change. And lastly, when faculty come together, we make things better for ourselves, for the professoriate, and ultimately for our students. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks to Ava and to the AAUP chapter for having me and for having us. I have just a quick question for you all today, which is, how did you get here? How did you know that this event was happening? And if you don't mind, just toss your answers out into the room. Did you see a flyer? Did you get an email? Did you come with a buddy? Email, AUP listserv. Anybody else? Any other ways that you got here today? Word of mouth. Who'd you hear it from? Ava, wonderful. That's called organizing. Okay, great. I just want to say, you being here at this event today is a good thing, and it's a powerful thing. And if you want to keep going, this is kind of how we build, right? At the next event, you bring a coworker with you, right? And at the event after that, that coworker brings someone with them. And I see some high fives out there of coworkers who came together. Yes, fantastic. All right, you guys are on your way. More high fives. Wonderful. All right. My name is Mia McIver. I teach as a contingent faculty member at UCLA, and I wear a lot of hats, as the affiliations on the slide will tell you. I am going to talk today about the 3-year bargaining campaign that I led at the University of California for contingent faculty there. And on this slide, when I say who we are, the we that I'm talking about is my local union, UCAFT Local 1474, University Council, American Federation of Teachers. And we are 7,000 contingent faculty at all 10 University of California campuses. And we teach about 1/3 of all the classes at the UC in virtually every department, program, school, unit, you name it. We are full-timers and we are part-timers. We are people who teach 1/4 and then are gone. We are people who also can build teaching careers at the UC. So our bargaining unit and our membership is very diverse in terms of our working conditions. So prior to 2019, where we started with faculty compensation, on paper, things were looking pretty good. Our salary ranges, we didn't actually have a salary scale, but we had a salary range that set the minimum and the maximum possible salaries for our job titles. Most of us in UCAFT are in lecturer job titles. On paper, our salary ranges looked as if we had middle-class salaries. In 2019, our full-time annual wages ranged from about $53,000 all the way up to about $166,000. So the UC administration was really able to be very self-congratulatory about this, and they pat themselves on the back for providing great working conditions, great salaries for their contingent. The reality, though, was very different. Most lecturers were not able to get full-time work, even though they wanted it. Most were unbenefited. At the wages at 6 of the 9 UC campuses were below the poverty line for those counties where the campuses are located. And the actual median annual salary for a UC lecturer was about $19,000. So the situation was pretty dire. After 3 years of a long fought and hard won campaign, I'm very happy to share our victory. On compensation, we won 30% raises across the bargaining unit, and that included immediate increases when we ratified our contract that outpaced inflation. We particularly fought to raise the floor of our salary range to really have the maximum impact on our coworkers who were earning the least. And so we lifted the floor of our salary range immediately, 9.5%. Even before 2019, we had a merit raise structure for lecturers who were long-term career lecturers. We also, when we settled the contract in 2021, extended that merit increase structure across the entire bargaining unit. So now even our members who are first year lecturers, third year lecturers are eligible for merit increases every time their appointment is renewed. And we won a clear and transparent salary scale that both makes the implementation of these raises much easier, and it's easier to find and detect and troubleshoot problems when they do arise. And Glinda, as you were just saying, it's also important to have that salary scale transparency so that we can analyze our salary data for equity and for diversity, and make sure that that our members are not being discriminated against. All right. So how our salary scale works, and again, this is the salary scale for contingent faculty at the UC. The tenure stream faculty have a salary scale that works in a similar but not an identical way. But we negotiate cost of living increases. Generally, those are annual cost of living increases, but sometimes we build the power to win, for example, 2 cost of living increases in 1 year, especially when inflation is running high. Typically, since I've been an activist, those cost of living increases have run from about 3 to 7% annually, and so those are contractually bargained for and depend on the outcome of negotiations. And then to those we add performance-based increases. Our collective bargaining agreement generally provides for minimums, for minimum salaries, for minimum merit increases, and then at the discretion of departments and schools and programs, they can exceed those minimums. It may not surprise you to hear that at the University of California, lecturers in the business and law schools are paid a little bit higher than lecturers in, say, Asian languages and cultures, or in sociology. And so, because of those market forces, there is some discretion on the part of individual departments. Every reappointment is preceded by a performance review. And in recognition of the positive performance review, there's a minimum 3% raise. There are 2 promotion points. One is a promotion to continuing lecturer after 6 cumulative years of service credit. And a continuing appointment for a continuing lecturer is an indefinite ongoing appointment. It does not need to be renewed. There is no reappointment. It's like a regular job, as a matter of fact. And people can be terminated for cause, people can be laid off. It is not, strong tenure, but it is a pretty good measure of job security. And then in 2021, we also won a second promotion point to senior continuing lecturer, so that our mid and late career members also have opportunities for advancement and promotion. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the strategic considerations and some of the lessons that I learned from our bargaining campaign. The first thing I'll say is that the compensation part of our contract was just one fraction of it. And we had several very important non-economic demands, especially around job security and especially around workload. For us, in 2019 to 2021, we found that money in the end was actually the easiest thing to win at the bargaining table. That our administration was much more dug in and much more protecting their power, protecting their prerogative over job security and over workload, and much more willing to put money on the table. And in fact, I would characterize it as they tried to buy us off of some of our other core demands. Happy to say we stayed strong and didn't make. There are always trade-offs, but we didn't make some of those big trade-offs that the administration really wanted us to make. So, to win something like this, it really takes a leadership conviction that transformational change is both necessary and possible. And
Bill and Glenda, that's what I love about what we've heard from you today is you've really been showing, that these changes are both necessary and possible. And it takes, you have to maintain that conviction throughout fear, throughout uncertainty, throughout doubt. And you have to help others believe, right, that there is that future, that there is that vision, that there is that horizon of equity and of fairness and of educational and of labor justice. It takes ownership of the campaign's goals from every constituency and at every step of the way. And that's why I'm so excited to see so many of you here today responding to the call from your AAUP chapter leadership to be involved and to be active and to be engaged and to have a role and have a voice in shaping your workplace. So we had collective bargaining demands that were developed and ratified by all of our rank and file members. We had very large and very broadly representative bargaining teams and organizing committees. We had very clear deliberation and decision-making processes so that everybody could have input. And we had a commitment to putting as many of our resources as possible towards lifting up and elevating the least privileged among us in our bargaining unit. We didn't write anyone off, right? We didn't say, oh, we're not going to go organize in engineering because we don't think the engineers are going to be with us, right? And we didn't say, oh, the folks who only teach one class a year, we're not going to organize with them because, we don't think they're invested in the institution. We talked to everybody and we asked everybody to join the campaign. It also really took power analysis to identify the key decision makers and then to really develop the courage to honestly take the fight to those key decision makers. And there on the screen, you'll see some media coverage. UC faculty poised for strike. That's in the fall of 2021. And you see President Michael Drake there featured in that news article, which was exactly what we had hoped for, right? We wanted to make our campaign and our demands a referendum on President Drake's leadership. If recruiting and retaining the best teaching faculty is not our institution's highest priority, then what are we doing here, right? That was the question that we asked. That was the question that we brought to President Drake. And we wanted to ask him to claim our university as an educational institution, not primarily as a financial institution, right? It took leverage that we created through multi-pronged strategies. What you see on the slide there is an op-ed in the LA Times written by a lecturer at UC Irvine who was churned out of her job. You also see support from California state legislators writing to the office of the president and expressing their support for our demands. So we had intentional political and legal and media and solidarity strategies, and we cultivated a number of those relationships even before bargaining began, and maintained them through our bargaining campaign. And we took our message directly to legislators. I think, Bill, that you're saying, about the money is there. The legislators, for us, confirmed that, right? And agreed with us. And when we put our salary data right in institutional context and in economic context, the legislators were happy to lend their support because they recognized how much urgency there was in our campaign. And it took a lot of solidarity internally and externally, right? Which is not always easy, right? It is challenging. And it can be a rocky road to travel. But in 2003, when UC lecturers went on strike to win continuing appointments. The university administration really used that moment as a divide and conquer moment, right? To introduce tiers and hierarchies within our bargaining unit and to say, all right, you guys have just won some significant job security. We're going to reserve that for a tiny fraction of your bargaining unit while increasing the precarity of everyone else in your bargaining unit, right? We learned from that experience. We knew that we couldn't let that happen again. When the UC administration raised the idea of having different salary scales for different campuses, we had quite a vigorous internal debate about this. But ultimately, we said, no, that's not going to work for us. Because where the cost of living is the lowest in California? It's at Merced and it's at Riverside. It's at our most racially diverse campuses, right? So yes, our faculty at Berkeley and Santa Cruz and Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, the cost of living is higher there. But our unity is more important to us, and our solidarity is more important. We're not going to accept differing salary scales for different campuses. We connected everything to our university's fundamental educational mission, right? And we also unsuccessfully, ultimately, really tried to build some bridges to the tenure stream faculty and to the academic senate. I'm sorry to say that at the UC in 2019 to 2021, the academic senate actually publicly opposed our demands and publicly opposed our campaign. The tenure stream faculty at the UC are not currently unionized. Who knows? Maybe that will change in the future. But during our bargaining campaign, the Office of the President really fed some propaganda to the academic senate, and regretfully, I think there wasn't enough kind of critical pushback. So I've only scratched the surface of our bargaining campaign, of our compensation structure. Happy to talk more. Here's some contact information. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Please stay in touch.
Is this on? Yeah, it is. Great question. I actually got into leadership because I wanted to change that environment, right? And I wanted to model, I think, a different strategic approach than I had seen, in the last decade or so. So, first of all, I mean, not everything works the same way everywhere, right? And so we can learn lessons from each other, and we can talk about what works in one place. But if this is your logo, this is your logo, right? If this is what people connect to, if this is what people engage with, then go with it, right? So our environment was one in which I think the least privileged members of our bargaining unit were suffering tremendously and suffering in silence, and did not have an outlet did not have a voice, did not have a way to talk about the enormous challenges that they were facing. And so I hope what we did through our campaign is, create the channels for that communication to actually happen and for it to lead to change.
So what's it like to work at a place where you get a cost of living increase? Well, since we don't get one, how would I know? So you cost of living increase, and you said 3 to 7%, and then raises with renewals and promotions and the like. Maybe I'm going to switch to Bill now. At Western, the data you were showing us, is that cost of living across the board, or are there also steps and promotions of any kind?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have said that. Those are across the board raises. There are also just built-in promotion raises, post tenure review raises. I mean, when you get promoted from assistant to associate, or from lecturer to senior lecturer, that comes with a 10% increase. When you get promoted from, and I'm not sure what the new title is for the second bump for the lecturers, but that's another 10% increase, in the same way that promotion from associate to full is a 10% increase. And we do our PTR reviews every 5 years, and that comes with a 3% increase when you pass those. Post tenure review. So even if you're not coming up for a promotion, I mean, it used to be, before we were unionized, we had to do these reviews on a regular basis. They never came with any money. That was completely dispiriting, and everybody. And one of the first things we negotiated in a very early contract was the tenure and promotion raises and the regular PTR raises, and those are all on top of the across the board raises that you saw in the first slide that I had.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could talk about whether organizing your faculty did in fact improve your ability to recruit and retain underrepresented faculty, which I think remains a persistent and pernicious issue here. So did organizing actually lead to you being able to get the folks you want and keep the folks you want?
That's a great question. And that's one of the things that we're looking at AAUP National. And what we found is that chapters that start to bargain, especially collective bargaining chapters that started to bargain racial equity issues, had an ability to also retain underrepresented groups as members and recruit underrepresented groups as members. One of the things that Mia talked about, and one of the things that is going around across the country, is this issue of, when we sit at the table, are we also sitting at the table with a racial and gender equity lens? And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about what Mia talked about, is this unwillingness to allow one group to not be as affluent with some of the raises and some of the ways in which we get to bargaining without looking at the least of the most vulnerable. And I think that that's what we're finding more and more, that as
collective bargaining chapters, as chapters are now looking at the vulnerable groups and how do we incorporate that in our decision making, in the ways in which we deal with and talk with administration. I think that we're doing that. And one of the things that we're also trying to do is how do we from AAUP National start helping chapters in doing that? And that's one of the things that will come out and have been coming out with regard to the Racial Equity Initiative. Great question.
Yes.
So here at the University of Washington, some of us, including me, have a little appendage to our titles. I'm a professor, WOTRF, which is not a swear word. Although it sort of is, it's without tenure for reasons of funding. Do those titles exist on your campuses?
I mean, the short answer is no, and we'd never agree to a title like that in the contract. I mean, without tenure for reasons of funding just doesn't make sense. I mean, I suppose in some administrative labyrinth, you could, you know, if you're putting buckets of money in one place or another and say, well, the money's just not there. But again, that's just a much easier thing to do when you're not forced to sit down at the table and agree. You know, the idea, it's not that there's not funding. There's, I mean, UW is like the Vatican. I mean, you know, you guys own half the real estate in downtown Seattle. You only want to follow your own rules. You know, I mean, it's a $16 billion operation or something. And so it's not about not having money there. It's just what you want to spend it on. And one of the things that, I mean, this is maybe a little sideline, but it's a total hobby horse of mine now, is that one of the things that drives a lot of that is institutional debt. That there's a natural tension in sort of neoliberal universities, a natural tension that develops between the academic side of the house and the financial side of the house. And the CFO's job is to hoard as much money as they can to keep their bond ratings up. I mean, everybody flipped out at my institution. You know, we have like $150 million in institutional debt. Our Moody's rating got downgraded during the pandemic because, you know, all of our students weren't living in dorms or eating in dining halls anymore. And that has been a huge concern for I mean, you know, how do we get our bond ratings back up is very much a concern. And that drives a lot of the defunding of the academic side of the university. That's not anything you asked about, but.
Thank you so much. This has been really helpful. One of the challenges that we face across UW in terms of salary equity is that our institution has imposed a highly neoliberal budgeting model. On the Seattle campus, ABB, on the Bothell and Tacoma campuses is kind of our activity-based budgeting, and for Bothell, it's RCM. The problem, well, there's many problems with it, but one of the problems when it comes to salaries is that a lot of our efforts to increase salaries get pushed back to our units. And then our units are on the hook to afford them. And so when we go through things like a unit adjustment process where we're trying to make equity adjustments for faculty salaries, only the units that can actually afford this are able to do anything. So I'm wondering if you have faced similar kind of budget situations at your institutions, and if so, how you've been able to negotiate for faculty salary increases across the board against those budget models.
So this has been a particular issue at the University of California in the wake of the settlement of the UAW contracts. Exactly what you talked about, where the Office of the President is responsible for negotiating the contract centrally, and then it's not even campuses, it's individual departments who are responsible for paying the additional wages. I don't have any particular good news from the UC. I can say that in our bargaining campaign, we put on the table a proposal that any and all salary increases for the life of this contract would be funded by the Office of the President, right? That that department budgets would grow in order to pay those salary increases. We did not win that this time around, but our language was modeled on the California Faculty Association contract, CFA, which represents faculty, coaches, counselors at the Cal State campuses, at the 23 Cal State campuses. They just took a strike authorization vote, by the way. They do have, it's one sentence in their enormous collective bargaining agreement that commits the CSU Chancellor's office to funding all raises that are agreed to in the contract. So there is a model for that out there.
And I'd like to add that our university shifted to the RCM model. When you said that, it made me think about that. And we also have a collective bargaining chapter, and we still have been able to do very well with our raises, across the board raises. And I will agree with what Bill talked about. There are a number of different places in our contract where there's additional compensation. At every rank and raise, we have the additional compensation. We also, if we have overload pay, then we've increased how much we get paid over in overload. So there's other ways in which in the contract that you can try to create some additional compensation for faculty.
That ABE, ABB, and RCM stuff, that's just another way to count money. And it's usually designed to hide the fact that huge amounts of money are being skimmed from the places that actually produce the revenue and being given to offices that don't. The beautiful thing about collective bargaining is, though, you don't have to give a shit where the money comes from. You know, that it's a classic move for a dean to point to a provost and say he's got to pay for that, and a provost to point to a dean and say they've got to pay for that. As though somehow when the money moves from the president's office to the provost's office to a dean's office, it's Confederate money now or something. I mean, that it's all green money. It all is part of the university. And if you bargain a contract that says, you know, everybody gets a 5% raise next year, where the money comes from doesn't matter. They're contractually obliged to give you a 5% raise. And so you can dispense with at the bargaining table, you can get rid of a lot of those kind of conversations of them wanting you to be interested in the parlor domino games of money in one division or another. And it's like, look, we don't care where the money comes from. You just got to give us this much. And dispensing with those kind of conversations is really refreshing a lot of times.
Yeah, I'm glad that the conversation has moved to neoliberalism and to a department level adjustments. I think, as always, I want to applaud AAUP for all the work to produce these very thorough reports. Those of us who have been here longer will find them not shocking at all. It's very clear what has been going on for two decades at least. But what I am missing in these reports, and I want to urge AAUP to look at it with great urgency in the next report, is the egregious toxic inequities that have been produced within departments in the last 12 or so years, in which the university has put all its efforts in retentions as the only vehicle to actually gain significant salary increases. And what is missed here is that a neoliberal policy of retention creates a small minority of privileged people who have the ability to seek outside offers, and a majority who are, because of age, of disability, of caregiving obligations of not being willing to uproot, and all kinds of other reasons, who are not able to try to get individual salary increases of 25%, $40,000 from one year to another. In my departments, I'm in two, that has created now inequities that are bizarre. That, you know, people of equal rank, oftentimes, much less service years at UW, earn easily 50% more salary than others. I cannot tell you how toxic that has been and how toxic the work environment in these departments have become. Because when you actually want to raise this, it is very uncomfortable. And especially those who are very privileged in their salaries are then clamming up. They cannot even get themselves to say the most basic solidarity things about those of us who have been left behind in the system of inequity. And I think this is something that really stares in the face, especially in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I think AAUP really has to get to the bottom of that. Thank you.
And yeah, if y'all had a union, you'd have a much more complicated situation on your hands than we have at the regionals. You have a very stratified faculty arrangement. But creating, you know, college professors are hard to organize. Solidarity does not come naturally to us, generally speaking, and that would be stuff that you would be able to work out internally and then go to the table in a unified way. And rather than, as long as everybody gets to run to the boss and say, cut me a special deal, you're going to continue to have those kinds of situations. Yeah. Yeah. This is a system that is ageist, it's ableist, it's anti-family, it's anti-societal to solidarity and to the principle that you have same compensation for the same labor. That needs to be named and not hidden. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Hi, I would like to hear a little more about workload and how you've been able to negotiate that into union bargaining. And the context for the question is that I've been surprised to learn how different people, you know, sort of like assigned teaching loads are, or allocations of different job duties across the 3 campuses at UW. And so I'm just interested in hearing a little bit more about how workload has been something that the collective bargaining process has helped address.
So in most collective bargaining agreements, the workload is kind of outlined. Western has a collective bargaining chapter, and we also have in our contract a workload. And in our collective bargaining contract, an academic faculty has 12 credit hours that we have to work both fall and spring. So it's a 24 credit hour workload. And then within that, we also in that contract talk about how we could work to adjust that workload. And if we wanted to teach, let's say, more in the fall versus in the spring, all of that information is kind of laid out in that workload. We also have language in our collective bargaining agreement that talks about what is the work. So not only are you outlining how much and how many classes, but what is specifically the work of faculty. And so a lot of times some of that information can get clarified when the information is written down. And I'm just using an example of what we have in our collective bargaining agreement at Western Michigan University, because it could be easily construed as Western Washington, but Western Michigan. So I think what happens is through the, as Bill constantly has been talking about, there's always this constant communication and dialogue that becomes a part of the process. And as Mia talked about, that it becomes a normal and regular discussion as the contract begins and it's initiated. And then after that, there's a term limit on the end of the contract, and there are continued conversations about it.
I think that's a great question, because what surprised me the most from our bargaining campaign, we had 3 campaign pillars. We won on compensation. We won big on job security. We did not win on workload. And management protected their flexibility around workload more fiercely than on any other issue. So our collective bargaining agreement for quite a while has defined a maximum workload. At the UC, there are 7 quarter campuses and 2 semester campuses. At the quarter campuses, there is a 9 course offering maximum annual workload. At the semester campuses, it's a 6 course offering annual maximum workload. So, no matter where you are, it's 3 courses per term maximum. And then departments, programs, and schools can set their own workload maximum lower. So I work in a program where the maximum course load is 7 courses per year. One of the biggest issues for us on workload that we've found very difficult to tackle at the table is about the halo of academic work that is not directly happening in the classroom. And UC management wants to tell us that all we do is teach. Meanwhile, we demonstrate through copious evidence and testimonials that we do quite a bit of service. We do quite a bit of mentoring. We do enormous, emotional labor. And we research and publish, on a voluntary basis on our own time. They do not want to include those activities in our job descriptions because they do not want to have to pay us for those. They want to continue to get that work for free. So that is a huge challenge for us going forward.
Yeah, our workload, I mean, it's 2 separate things for the tenure track folks and the non-tenure track. For the tenure track people, what we did was enshrine what were the teaching loads and the course caps for all departments. They can't go above what they were in 2008. So they can't raise the number of courses we teach. They can't raise the limits on the courses. For non-tenure track faculty, exactly that problem of service became a very big deal for us, and we got very tight. I mean, that was a big bargaining point for us a couple of years ago. And we make them now very specifically write the non-tenure track contracts. And if it's not in your contract, you don't have to do it. And they can't make you do it. They can't ask you to do it unless they want to pay you more, unless they want to make some sort of addendum to your contract and pay you more. So if they're going to use the line of all you do is teach, we hold them to that. And say if the contract says, you teach this many classes, that's all they're obliged to do. If the contract says you teach these many classes and you serve on the committee, it's got to say what you get paid to serve on that committee. So we and it's been hit and miss, but we're trying very hard to enforce that as a real standard for those contracts.
Folks, I think I'm going to suggest there's wine and food, that we continue the conversation, not end the conversation, but continue it in the back of the room in a more relaxed manner. I know we all have more questions to ask, but I'd like to thank our 3 fabulous panelists. And bring up the leader for one.
I've got a question for you when we get a moment.
Okay. Okay.
You know where this thing came from?
Oh, there's a staff person back there.
Oh.